Good evening, brethren. So good to see you. I wish I could see you. One of the things that I like to do when I give tours of the lodge is go to the first 100-year past masters. It's just a treasure chest full of great characters and great examples of Masons in Concord. Usually I start, and the reason we know about all of this is because of this. This is a history of Corinthian Lodge and the bylaws from 1859 from this guy, Louis A. Surratt. More about him later. Isaac Hurd was said to be Corinthian Lodge's first pillar of wisdom and its most influential, firm, and zealous friend. He was the master of the lodge in 1797 until 1801, and the next year, by unanimous vote, he was re-elected, but he declined. He was then elected as Junior Grand Warden of our Most Worshipful Grand Lodge, and the next year Senior Grand Warden. Isaac Hurd is a guy who was involved in just about everything. Isaac Hurd was the fourth president of the Concord Fire Society, and he died in November of 1844 at age 88 after being a physician and surgeon in town for over 66 years. Francis Jarvis was the fourth master of the lodge, and his portrait is by the treasurer station in the lodge. He was the first brother to be raised in Corinthian Lodge. However, he was initiated and crafted at St. Paul's Lodge in Groton. He was a baker by trade, and his place of work was actually what is today the Wright's Tavern. Unlike many of the other brothers at the time who were the doctors, lawyers, people of higher stature, he was a baker, but he was a man who really strived for knowledge and truth and everything that we would consider like doing the right thing. And being such, they really did see him as one of their equals, which is why they made him the first brother to be raised at Corinthian. Eli Brown was master of the lodge from 1819 to 1820. He is the master who was instrumental in working with the town to contribute $400 to have our very lodge building constructed. His portrait currently is on the southeast wall behind the secretary station. John Keyes is a very interesting character. He was a politician, he was a lawyer by trade, he was involved in many business ventures here in Concord. He was the director of Concord Bank. He was a member of the Mill Dam Corporation, which basically the ones that took down the dam and built the center of town to be the way it is today. He was on the trustees of Middlesex Institution for Savings. He was president of Middlesex Mutual Fire Insurance Company. And he was also, for about a 6-year period, a state senator. William Whiting was master of the lodge for 7 terms, albeit many of those terms were during the anti-Masonic period where the lodge may have met maybe once a year, but 7 terms nonetheless. He was also the first high priest of Concord Royal Arch Chapter before it moved to Framingham in 1826. Whiting started the first Concord Academy for the education of his own children, seeing that the public education wasn't up to snuff by his own standards. Later, that Concord Academy was also where I understand Thoreau was educated, since he was also one of the neighbor kids. He brought in later to teach at the academy a guy by the name of Frank Sanborn. Sanborn was part of John Brown's associates down in Virginia, and after the Harper's Ferry affair, the Virginia militia came up to arrest him. Now, outside of his house, where I believe Frank Sanborn was a boarder, they tried to arrest him, and a scuffle ensued, and this great etching was done to illustrate what had happened that day. And eventually, a brother who was a judge wrote a habeas corpus and sent the Virginians back. Ebenezer Wood came into office strangely because William Whiting was promoted to District Deputy Grand Master, so he moved into the office from March until October when he was moved on to the next master. He is best known for working for the better part of several decades on and off for William Monroe, who was the first commercial manufacturer, mass producer of pencils. The factory that he ran, or the remnants of it, can still be found on the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail in Acton. Lemuel Shattuck was our 15th master. He has a hospital named after him in Boston to this day. He's considered the father of modern vital statistics. He's one of the guys who really was a proponent of capturing the causes of death and tracing a lot of these things back to public sanitation and public health issues. His name is even inscribed on a place of learning in London to this day. Also, 1835, he wrote the first really detailed history of the town of Concord. He's also one of the co-founders of the New England Genealogical Historical Society and many other things. He was on the City Council of Boston in 1837. Mikaja Rice was actually initiated at King Solomon's Lodge in Charlestown in 1824, where he made it to the rank of senior warden up through 1829 before things really slowed down for the anti-Masonic period. He actually went through the Royal Arch degrees at St. Paul's Chapter in Boston, where Simon W. Robinson was the high priest. He was admitted into membership in Corinthian in 1845 and soon made his way to master. More interestingly than Mikaja Rice, however, is his family. He lived on 44 Bedford Street, which is a house that's still there, and it's right behind the old cemetery in town. That house was actually the busiest underground railroad station in Concord and was run by his wife Mary. She was also a school teacher, which the school was the lodge, and there early in the Civil War, she had all the students sign a letter that they wrote to President Lincoln asking him to free the slave children. And President Lincoln responded. And here's a copy of both of those letters. Pretty remarkable. The letters, I don't know where they currently are. I know that all the schools have copies of them, all the elementary schools in town. And the letter from Lincoln recently sold, I don't know how recently, but it sold for $3.5 million. Worshipful Rice's son, William Sidney Rice, was also a Mason. And he responded to President Lincoln's call to arms and was soon taken prisoner by the Confederacy. And at a communication in December 1863, I believe it was, a letter from the Grand Master of Masons in Louisiana was read, stating that Brother Rice was in his care and would be well taken care of. 6 months later, William Sidney Rice was back at Corinthian Lodge, returned as part of the prisoner exchange. James Weir is a very interesting Mason. He was born in England and became a sailor when he was in his teen years. He was shanghaied a few times into the British Navy, where he was present at the turning over of Napoleon at Elba. He was in several battles with French ships in the Indian Ocean. Just fascinating stories that you think of only in like books and movies. He was initiated in 1821, but wasn't master until 1850s. So that's kind of interesting. He was around as a member of Corinthian Lodge through the darkest years of the anti-Masonic period. As a trade, he was a tailor, which is something he picked up while as a sailor. I'm sure that's a very important skill to have as a sailor. And had his shop up above the post office. Our 22nd master was Brother Louis A. Surratt, who we owe a great debt for. Without him, I wouldn't know half the things I do. Because in 1859, he wrote a history of Corinthian Lodge that included every brother raised by year, with all the returns every year up until 1859, the bylaws of the lodge as of 1859, and a biography of every master of the lodge up until that point. Brother Surratt is from Nova Scotia. He's actually an Acadian. At the age of 7, he was sent to be raised by a priest in an abbey, by a Father Signon. And for 12 years, that priest gave him a very intense education. that wasn't readily available to other men in Nova Scotia. When he left the priest at age 19, he went back home, worked as a fisherman for a while, was at sea, did a little bit of clerking for different trading companies. Got permission by his parents to seek his own fortune in Boston, where he went, and he was a clerk there as well, where he set up all kinds of different trade, and after a while started his own business. And at one point in his life, he had over 30 ships that were spread out between New England, the Caribbean, and the Mediterranean. He had his hand in just about everything. It wasn't until the 1870s that his fortune really had a turn for the worst, when the treaties between Canada and the U.S. were canceled, and tariffs went into place, and that totally reversed his fortune. But until then, he was a very successful businessman, and again, to him we owe a great gratitude. He was Master of the Lodge 1852, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and again in the 1860s. And it's really, I think, to him we owe the gratitude for bringing the lodge out of the dark period of the anti-Masonic period and bringing it back to life. Ephraim Bull, the developer of the Concord grape. He developed the grape to withstand the harsh New England winters. And unfortunately, he didn't have any kind of patent protection or anything on his grapes. And once they were sold, others raised more from the cuttings, and he died penniless. He lived in this house on Lexington Road, next door to the Alcotts. He's buried here in Concord, and as you can see, his epitaph reads, "He sowed, others reaped." Benjamin Tolman was a newspaper publisher and an abolitionist. His house was also one of the stops on the Underground Railroad. His house is today the Art Museum, and if you go inside, turn to the right by the visitor's desk. Behind you, you'll find a fireplace. To the right, you'll find a door, which was the hiding place. They don't advertise it, but you can actually open it up, look inside, and see some of the folk art that's inside. We don't really know where it came from, but it's awfully interesting. In 1870, a committee was appointed to consider adding another story to the lodge to be used as a lodge room. The selectmen of Concord voted not to add another story, and that the lodge was informed that the roof was unsafe and should be repaired. Rather than repairing the roof, Brother James Gardy, shown here, offered his building for $250 a year. It was known as Gardy's Block, and is today the Coldwell Banker Building. The lodge soon moved in there under much fanfare, and much of the regalia we have today, some of the working tools, came from that period when there was much celebration for moving into the new building. In the meanwhile, the next master, William F. Hurd, who's the grandson of Isaac Hurd, bought the building, refurbished it, moved it 42 feet off the sidewalk to make more room for Monument Square, made the first floor into an engine house. The second floor was the schoolroom, and it continued on for a while until 1882, when the lodge moved back in. From there, we've got all the past masters around and since. Not to say anything less of them, but I think these guys are pretty interesting characters.